Well, good afternoon to everyone, or as the case may be, I know in a few cases, good morning. Just a few nights ago, many of us sat around the Seder table, unfortunately this year without our extended families, and recounted the story of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. The story we told is based primarily on the biblical account, and is truly the foundational history of the Jewish nation. What many of us do not or may not realize, however, is that there existed an alternative narrative of this event. In fact, the Exodus narrative, as told by Greek and Latin authors, emerged as the most popular account of Jews and Judaism in all of the Greco-Roman world. And it is this version, with its varieties and a constantly changing character, that I would like to share with you today. Based on the texts themselves, we're going to look at the texts themselves. And in a sense, we will be reading portions of what I might call a Greco-Roman Haggadah. Now, why is this important? We know how Greeks and Romans behaved towards Jews in antiquity, but we're not always privy to what they thought about the Jewish people. And so this version of the Exodus may contribute, at least in part, to filling in that gap in our knowledge. Before I continue, I want to thank Ariel for setting this up. And at the very end of my talk, there'll be time to ask a few questions. You can write them down through the chat process, and Ariel will read off a question or two, and I'll try to answer them. So try to hold back with the questions. I'm sure there might be a number. Now, in truth, the Greco-Roman version might even be termed a counter-history. Because in the Bible, very simply put, the Israelites want to leave Egypt. Moses constantly asks for this, and the Egyptians refuse. As we will see shortly, the Greeks and Romans relate almost a totally opposite picture. The Jews were evicted. They were forced out and even massacred as part of some sort of an ethnic cleansing. And we'll see that this doesn't happen immediately in Greco-Roman literature, but this very, very extreme tone and nature of the eviction becomes more and more prominent as we proceed in history. And so what we're going to do is look at some texts now, and I'll read them together with you, and we'll analyze them and see what might be relevant to our story. Now, the first text, and probably the earliest one that we have, was written, or at least is attributed, to an author by the name of Hecataeus of Abdera. Hecataeus of Abdera wrote a major book on Egypt, on the history of Egypt. He lived around the year 300 BCE, so he's really writing at the very beginning of the Hellenistic period. And in that book that describes the history of Egypt, he found room to insert the story of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. As we're going to see, Hecataeus is probably the most favorable, or one of the most favorable accounts of Jews and Judaism as they leave Egypt. And he says as follows: when in ancient times a pestilence arose in Egypt, the common people ascribed their troubles to the workings of divine agency. In other words, the gods were angry for a reason. Why? For indeed, with many strangers of all sorts dwelling in their midst, practicing different rites of religion and sacrifice, their own traditional observances in honor of the gods had fallen into disuse. Now, you notice something very interesting here. He's not talking about Jews. He's simply saying that Egypt is inundated by foreigners who are not part of the religious establishment or behavior that was expected by the local gods in Egypt. And so the natives of the land, meaning the indigenous Egyptian population, surmised that unless they removed the foreigners, their troubles would never be solved. In other words, what you have here is a general removal of foreigners. Now, it's very interesting who these foreigners were. At once, therefore, the aliens were driven from the country. Some say they were cast ashore in Greece and other regions, which means something very interesting. We're in good company. In fact, Hecataeus actually says that the people that were cast ashore in Greece were led by Danaos and Katmos, who are two mythic heroes in Greek mythology. And what that tells us is that these were very prominent people that were evicted from the country. The greater number, though, were driven into what is now called Judea, which is not far distant from Egypt and was at the time utterly uninhabited. Not quite, as we know from the biblical account. But not only not quite from the biblical account, the later Roman sources will tell us the exact opposite. Hecataeus could almost be considered an apologetic presentation on behalf of the Jews. So much so that there are historians who claim that this is a pseudo-Hecataeus, that in fact we have a Jewish hand recording some of this text rather than Hecataeus himself. The jury is still out on how much of a Jewish hand was involved here. But now comes another fact. So the land was utterly uninhabited. The colony was headed by a man called Moses, outstanding both for his wisdom and his courage. On taking possession of the land, he founded, besides other cities, one that is now the most renowned of all, called Jerusalem. Now this is interesting. If indeed a Jew were responsible for this text, wouldn't he know that Moses had nothing to do with Jerusalem, that he never entered the land of Canaan? And so here we have, I won't say a garbled version, but a different version, one that departs from the biblical narrative, places Moses in the center. That of course, is justified, but then goes on to say, on taking possession of the land, he founded, besides other cities, one that is now the most renowned of all, called Jerusalem. In addition, he established the temple that they hold in chief veneration, instituted their forms of worship, drew up their laws, and ordered their political institutions. Now, yes, he certainly drew up their laws, but regarding the building of Jerusalem and the founding of other cities, we know nothing of this, of course, and this seems to contradict, it does contradict the biblical account. But Hecataeus is doing something very interesting here. He's presenting Jewish history along the lines of Greek ethnography. When the Greeks talk about the founding of a nation, there are always three elements. The leader of the nation conquers the land, builds the polis, the Greek city, because there is no Greek culture and civilization without a polis, without a Greek city. So you conquer the land, you build the city, and you draw up the constitution. So we have Hecataeus here is describing how the Israelites, in fact, followed a standard and accepted pattern of establishing a nation. He also divided them into 12 tribes, which is the most perfect number. And then he says something very interesting. The sacrifices that he established differ from those of other nations, as does their way of living. And here, Hecataeus is aware of the fact that Jews are known as non-minglers with the rest of the population. But he makes an excuse for that. And he says that he established different sacrifices, a different way of living, for as a result of their own expulsion from Egypt, he introduced an unsocial and intolerant mode of life. In other words, Hecataeus is willing to accept that Jews are not part of the general society and maybe even standoffish, they're unsocial. Later on in Greco-Roman literature, Jews actually are presented as misanthropes. We're going to see that in a few minutes. So here, even when he had a negative element to present of the Jewish people, he seemed to apologize it. Yes, they are different, but there's a justification for this. They were evicted. The Egyptians misbehaved towards them. This is the earliest and probably the most positive version of the Exodus that we have in Greco-Roman literature. As I say, if indeed this was written by Hecataeus, we're talking about an account just after the days of Alexander the Great, the dawn of the Hellenistic era around the year 300. There's another source that also seems to be very sympathetic towards Jews, and that's number 2 here before us. It was written by a geographer, a historian and a geographer known as Strabo, who lived in the late 1st century of the Common Era and the very early part of the 1st century of the Common Era. He comes from Asia Minor, what we call Turkey today. He stayed for a time in Egypt, and he too is very sympathetic to Moses. And I brought his text here because of the line here that I love. He starts by saying why the Israelites even left Egypt, and this is striking. He says, first of all, that the most prevalent of the accredited reports in regard to the Temple of Jerusalem represents the ancestors of the present Judeans as Egyptians. In other words, the Judeans were Egyptians, but they decided to leave Egypt. Why? Moses, namely, was one of the Egyptian priests and held a part of Lower Egypt. But he went away from there to Judea, since he was displeased with the state of affairs there, meaning in Egypt, and was accompanied by many people who worshiped the divine being. For he, Moses, said and taught that the Egyptians were mistaken in representing the divine being by the images of beasts and cattle. In other words, Moses leaves Egypt because he can't accept the religious behavior, right, and the worship of gods that are in the form of animals. In other words, Moses is leaving for ideological reasons. It has nothing to do with slavery. It has nothing to do with torture. It's simply the wrong place for a good Jew to live. Not only is he opposed to the Egyptian religious behavior, he was also opposed to the fact that the Greeks were also wrong in modeling gods in human form. Now you'll notice there's a slight anachronism here. Moses had no idea what was going on in Greece and how the Greeks worshipped their gods. But Moses leads the people to Judea, and now comes what I think is my favorite line. Now Moses, saying things of this kind, persuaded not a few thoughtful men and led them away to this place where the settlement of Jerusalem now is. So here, like Hecataeus, he claims that Moses founded Jerusalem. But he goes a step further, and he tells us why Moses chose Jerusalem. He easily took possession of the place, since it was not a place that would be looked on with envy, nor yet one for which anyone would make a serious fight. Boy, I wish he were right. In other words, to talk about Jerusalem as a place that nobody would ever fight over, right? Gee, Strabo, if you only could see what's going on today. These two sources are definitely positive. They are, in a sense, if not apologetic, they know nothing wrong. They're not displeased with the Jews and their removal from Egypt. They were either evicted or they left for the right reasons. When we reach the 1st century BC, so even before Strabo, we see a definite change of attitude. And this is going to become more and more the dominant attitude towards the Jews. And here we have a source by a fellow called Lysimachos, who lived in the 2nd to 1st century BCE, and he gives us a very long description of why the Israelites were evicted. But things now change, I would say, not only rapidly, but in a very extreme way. We now read how the Egyptians behaved towards the Jewish people. In the reign of Horus, king of Egypt, this takes us to the 8th century BCE. Horus is a well-known Egyptian king in Roman literature. He was what we refer to as the king of the 24th dynasty, and it takes us to around the 8th century BCE. And during his reign, we are told by Lysimachos, the Jewish people who were afflicted with leprosy, scurvy, and other maladies, took refuge in the temples and lived a mendicant existence. By the way, this is interesting. The Jews are frequently referred to as beggars, as poor people, in a very negative manner by Greeks and Romans. But here, as opposed to what we saw in Hecataeus and in Strabo, there was something wrong with the Jewish people. They were afflicted with all sorts of plagues, leprosy, and of course, it is striking when we think that the leprosy might have been one of the plagues that the Egyptians were struck with. So here we have what I again call a reverse history, and things are now being applied to the Jews themselves. And because they were afflicted, I'm on the second line of this text here, they took refuge in the temples and lived a mendicant existence. The victims of disease being very numerous, a dearth ensued throughout Egypt. In other words, his assumption seems to be that these were workers who couldn't work wherever it was that they were employed, and as a result, the local economic situation took a hit. The victims of disease being very numerous, etc., King Horus thereupon sent to consult the oracle of Ammon about the failure of the crops. So apparently the Israelites worked in the fields, and now there's a failure of crops because the Israelites have all taken sick. The god told him to purge the temples of impure and impious persons. This is very important. They are not only impure, they are impious. They do not recognize the Egyptian deities. And that's a line that is going to recur, not just with Lysimachos, but with in a number of sources. And so the gods told the king to drive them out of these sanctuaries into the wilderness, to drown those afflicted with leprosy and scurvy, as the sun was indignant that such persons should live. You have to wonder, this idea of drowning the Israelites, could it possibly be rooted in the drowning of the young children, of the boys, at the very beginning of the book of Exodus, when Pharaoh decrees that the male young children, boys, be drowned? So it could be, but there's no proof of that. Nevertheless, the king is told to drown them. But Horus ordered them, meaning the priests, to draw up a list of the unclean persons and to deliver them into military charge to be conducted into the wilderness. In other words, the Egyptians conducted the Israelites into the wilderness. It's not the Israelites that are running away from Egypt here. But now comes the very harsh, very difficult test. And to pack the lepers into sheets of lead and sink them in the ocean. In other words, what you have now is not just an ethnic cleansing of Egypt, but wholesale massacre of the Israelites. The lepers and victims of scurvy having been drowned, the others were collected and exposed in the desert to perish. There they assembled and deliberated on their situation. At nightfall, they lit up a bonfire and torches. Some people claim that this is some sort of an allusion to lighting fires on Sabbath. I'm doubtful. And so we don't really know what this refers to. And on the following night, they kept a fast and implored the gods to save. On the next day, a certain Moses advised them to take their courage in their hands and make a straight track until they reached inhabited country. Remember what Hecatiah said. They went to a land that was totally inhabited. But from Lysimachos on, they captured an inhabited land, forcibly removed or murdered, right, the local residents, and captured that land. So now we have a complete reversal of what we saw before. Not only that, they reached inhabited country, and Moses, instructs the people to show goodwill to no man, to offer not the best but the worst advice, and to overthrow any temples and altars of the gods which they found. This is interesting. Here you have already a number of accepted images of Jews in Greco-Roman literature. They are misanthropes. They not only can't they be trusted, but their laws require them, right, as it were, to be dishonest towards others. But also they destroy temples. Now, if you remember, I said that Lysimachos seems to have lived somewhere in the 2nd to 1st century of the Common Era. What's going on in Judea at this time? He is a contemporary of the Hasmonean uprising and the Hasmonean conquests, the Maccabean conquests in Judea, in which they very often conquer pagan cities, will destroy pagan temples. And so what we might have here resonating is the Greek world or the Hellenistic world aware of the fact that Jews would destroy other people's temples. They traversed the desert and after great hardships reached inhabited land or inhabited country. There they maltreated the population, plundered and set fire to the temples. I'd like to dwell on this for a minute. They conquered a land that was inhabited by others. They literally then stole the land from the local inhabitants. And here I'm going to depart for a second. I'm sure that some of you out in the audience remember the very first Rashi, right, to the Torah, when Rashi says, why does the Torah begin with creation? Why not begin with the first law in the book of Exodus? And Rashi says, the point is that should the nations of the world claim that, in Hebrew, listimaten, you are crooks, you stole the land, right? Should the nations of the world say you stole the land from others, you can answer by saying God created the world and he divided the planet, as it were, as he saw fit. When the rabbis, and Rashi, of course, is quoting Talmudic literature, when the rabbis say, should the nations of the world claim that you stole an inhabited land, these texts tell us that the rabbis knew what they were talking about. That's exactly what the nations of the world in Greco-Roman literature will claim. This was not an uninhabited land. This was inhabited, and you maltreated the local population and then conquered that territory by force. And then they came to a country now called Judea, where they built a city in which they settled. So here again, Moses is responsible for building the city of Jerusalem. This town was called, now here, the Zimachos becomes really nasty. The town was called Hierosila. Hierosila in Greek means sacrilegious. And he says it fit them to call the city Hierosila sacrilegious because that's what they were. Only later did they realize this and change the name to Hierosolima, to Jerusalem. So here we have probably one of the most, I would say, extreme or blatant almost anti-Semitic accounts of the Israelite Exodus. This idea that there were plagues among the Israelites is repeated a number of times, except that we have additional information, and I chose to quote another text, number 4 here, by a fellow called Pompeius Trogos. Pompeius Trogos lived towards the end of the 1st century BC, the 1st century of the Common Era, in other words, the dawn of our Common Era. And he wrote a lot about the history of Macedonia and the various Hellenistic empires that followed Alexander the Great. His account, again, does not follow the Bible, but it seems to echo what we read in the Bible in a certain sense. He begins, of course, with an obvious mistake. The youngest of the brothers was Joseph. He's talking about the brothers, the sons of Jacob. His, meaning Joseph's son, was Moses, whom, besides inheritance of his father's knowledge, the comeliness of his person also recommended. We know nothing about Moses' appearance in the Bible, and yet here he becomes comely like his father Joseph. But the Egyptians, being troubled with scabies and leprosy, and here it doesn't at first say who the lepers were, and warned by an oracle, expelled him. Again, it's not Moses wanting to leave Egypt, it's Moses being expelled by the Egyptian. And he not only was Moses expelled, those who had the disease were also expelled out of Egypt, that the distemper might not spread among a greater number. Becoming leader of the exiles, he carried off by stealth, Moses did, the sacred utensils of the Egyptians. Now we know nothing about this in the Bible, but we do remember that they took clay kesef or clay zahav. They did take silver and golden utensils from their neighbors. But here, one wonders if this isn't simply going a step further and claiming that the Israelites took the sacred utensils of the Egyptians. And then he adds an interesting line. The Egyptians trying to recover them by force of arms. Running, right, racing after the fleeing Israelites. But what happened to the Egyptians? They were compelled by tempests, by storms, to return home. And you have to wonder if this is not a rationalization of the story of the splitting of the Red Sea. In other words, no, it wasn't a miracle, but there were storms that required the Egyptians to retreat. You'll notice, however, there is absolutely no mention in Pompeius Troglos or in Lysimachos or elsewhere of the defeat of the Egyptians, of the parting of the Red Sea, and the fact that thousands or many more than that were actually killed in trying to have the Israelites return to Egypt. And then he ends with a line which I think has maybe contemporary overtones, right? And as they, the Israelites, remembered that they had been driven from Egypt for fear of spreading infection, they took care in order that they might not become odious for the same cause to their neighbors, to have no communication with strangers. I would suggest that this is the first case of social distancing. In other words, they're removing themselves from society lest they infect others. And then at the end, he says, so their removal from society is not because of their laws as such, that they have antisocial laws, but because they were afflicted by various diseases, they removed themselves from society. And then, from having adopted on that particular occasion, they gradually became a religious, meaning this departure from strangers became a religious institution. All sorts of other stories were attached to the Exodus narrative of the Greeks and Romans. And I wanted to call out, point out a few of these things, because again, once the Exodus narrative became the standard Greco-Roman introduction to the history of the Jews, to the behavior of the Jews, then the Greek and Roman authors went to various other well-known practices of the Jews and tried to link it to the Exodus. And the most obvious one is Sabbath. The one thing that many Greek and Latin authors knew about Jews were they keep the Sabbath. Later on, by the way, the Roman historian Tacitus will say, yeah, they're lazy, and so they don't work one day a week. And then they got fond of laziness, and they figured, why only limit it to 1 day a week? Why not cease work for a whole year every 7 years? A nasty statement by Tacitus. We'll get to Tacitus in a few minutes. But there's another fellow who was also responsible for much of the calumny in describing the Exodus. His name is Appian. Appian, some of you may have heard of a book called Against Appian or Contra Appian, written by Josephus, a noted Jewish historian of the late 1st century, who wrote the history of the Jewish war and Jewish antiquities. He also wrote a short treatise known as Against Appian, where he, Josephus, collected all of the slander, all of the calumny that was spread around in the Greco-Roman world about Jews, not all of it, but much of it. And he considered Appian to be the head of this anti-Jewish school, at least in Alexandria. And we know that Appian, in fact, was a well-known scholar in Alexandria. He's the Egyptian equivalent of Philo, and he lives at the exact same time. And he also wrote a history of Egypt. And in that history, he has a lot to say about Jews. And he also talks about the origin of the Sabbath. And he says the following, and of course, this is Josephus. I'm quoting from Josephus's Against Appian, who says the following. After stating that the fugitives numbered 110,000, he, Appian, gives an astonishing and plausible explanation of the etymology of the word Sabbath, or Shabbat. And he says, after 6 a 6 days march, meaning the Israelites leaving Egypt after a 6 days march, they developed tumors in the groin. And that was why, after safely reaching the country now called Judea, they rested on the 7th day. Now comes an outstanding, outlandish claim, maybe. And they called that day, the 7th day, Sabbaton, preserving the Egyptian terminology for disease of the groin in Egypt is called sabbatosis. And so here you have a linking of the Exodus version of Greco-Roman literature, the fact that after they had tumors of the groin, could not proceed, they had to rest on the 7th day, and they called that day Sabbath or sabbatosis because that's the word in Egyptian for a pain in the groin. Again, I think Appian went out of his way to tell this sort of a very uncomfortable, nasty story. And this is very typical, and Josephus calls him up on this, on his attitude towards the Jews. And we'll get back to Appian. Maybe I'll say this right now. Why was Appian so opposed to presenting a positive picture of the Jews? Before I mentioned that Greeks were aware of the Hasmonean offensive against Greek cities in the land of Israel and against opposition to embracing Hellenistic behavior of one sort or another. But there's something else going on in Alexandria where Appian lives, and that is that Jews seek to receive at least partial Alexandrian citizenship. They want to be the equal of the local Alexandrian population, the Greek population. And Appian is against this. And he comes out against this a number of times. And by besmirching, by spreading this type of story, or these types of stories about Jews, what he's saying is, yes, they've lived in Egypt for a while, but look, this is what we know about them. Are we going to grant them citizenship of the illustrious polis of Alexandria? And so Appian might have had a definite interest in telling stories like this. And then there's another historian, and here we go to the Roman historiography, and maybe one of the most important Roman historians of the late 1st century, Tacitus, who wrote a major history where he devotes a large portion, one of the largest portions that we find in all of ancient literature, a large portion to the Jews. It's a very difficult text for a Jew to read because it is decidedly anti-Jewish, but not only that, it's not just anti-Jewish, it conjures up statements or thoughts about Jews that even for a modern person are very uncomfortable. For instance, he'll say, yes, people joined their ranks, and once they joined their, meaning they convert to Judaism, once they joined their ranks, they send monies to Jerusalem. And so Jews from the very earliest times have become a wealthy people. When you read a statement like that, right, written almost 2,000 years ago, you ask yourself, what's going on here? And he'll say, he has one very, very extreme statement, everything that we consider to be sacred, they consider to be profane, and vice versa. In other words, they are the exact opposite of us. And sometimes we don't realize, but historians like Tacitus, beginning with the Renaissance in Europe, in early modern Europe, if you studied Latin, you read Tacitus. If you were a high schooler, right, somebody of high school age, you read Tacitus, and you would read statements like that. And so it's not just something that the ancients believed, but it had an effect in modern times. But here I chose one text out of Tacitus, which I found very, very interesting. Again, he begins, most authors agree that once during a plague in Egypt, right, which caused bodily disfigurement, King Horus approached the oracle, and he was told to purge his kingdom and to transport this race, meaning the Israelites, into other lands, to evict them, since it was hateful to the gods. So again, the exact reverse history, reverse to the Bible, where the Israelites don't want to leave, but rather they are evicted by the Egyptians because they're hateful to the gods. So the crowd was searched out and gathered together. being abandoned in the desert. Others lay idle and weeping. Only one of the exiles, Moses by name, warned them not to hope for help from the gods or men. This is interesting, right? He, Apion, projects Moses as being the ultimate atheist. You won't get any help from God. You won't need help from men. So he's antisocial. He's a misanthrope, which again is the prototype Jew in Greco-Roman eyes of a certain period. And he's also an atheist. He is the real heretic, right? And not us. And the people agreed and set out on their journey in utter ignorance. And now comes an interesting story. Nothing caused them so much distress as scarcity of water. And in fact, they had already fallen exhausted over the plain, nigh unto death, when a herd of wild asses moved from their pasture to a rock that was shaded by a grove of trees. Moses followed them, meaning the wild asses, and conjecturing the truth from the grassy ground, discovered abundant streams of water. This relieved them. And then he continues, and then they marched 6 days, again, 6th day and the 7th day, continuously, and on the 7th day seized a country, expelling the former inhabitants. He's leaving nothing to the imagination. They seized the country, expelled the inhabitants, and founded a city and dedicated a temple. What is interesting are the asses that led Moses to water. And I really should have continued with Tacitus a few lines further on, because then he tells us something very interesting. He says that once the Jews arrived at the temple, they dedicated in a shrine a statue of that creature whose guidance enabled them to put an end to their wandering and thirst. In other words, the Israelites will enshrine some sort of statue of an ass, of a donkey, because it was the donkey that saved them from thirst during their wandering in the desert. And sure enough, again, Apion takes this. He knew this even before Tacitus, and look what he has to say in this next text here. Within this sanctuary, and this is Josephus telling us this, Apion has the effrontery to assert that the Jews kept an ass's head, worshiping that animal and deeming it worthy of the deepest reverence. And this fact was disclosed, he maintains, on the occasion of the spoliation of the temple, the Jerusalem temple, by Antiochus Epiphanes, when that head of the ass, made of gold and worth a high price, was discovered. So we have now, of course, the best possible testimony from who else to be believed but Antiochus Epiphanes, famous Antiochus, that the Jews have some sort of, in their sanctuary, an ass's head made out of gold, and they worship it. And yet another historian, Diodorus, right, and I brought this here as well, tells us that Antiochus entered the innermost sanctuary, finding there, this is a bit different, a marble statue of a heavily bearded man seated on an ass. And this is clearly Moses sitting on an ass with a book in his hand. He's also the lawgiver. He supposed it to be an image of Moses, the founder of Jerusalem and the organizer of the nation. Again, so this idea that Moses founded Jerusalem now becomes the accepted truth in Greco-Roman literature, and who, meaning Moses, ordained for the Jews their misanthropic and lawless customs. So here again, the trope is the idea that Jews are misanthropic, and now we can take it back to the Exodus story, right? Oh, we almost went to what I wanted to show you. Something very interesting happens with this ass, the worship of the ass. I'll tell you a little private. As I was preparing this talk, I was reminded, and those of you who have the Encyclopedia Judaica at home could check this out later on. 53 years ago, I wrote the article in the Encyclopedia Judaica, Ass Worship, right? Where I gathered up all of the testimonies of Jews who worship the ass. And apparently what happened is that at some stage in history, not only did Romans believe that Jews worship an ass or an ass's head, but they then could not always distinguish between Jews and Christians. And so you begin to hear that some Romans actually believe that it is Christians and not just Jews, or that both of them worship and ask. One very famous Christian author of the second and the third century, Tertullian, tells us that the close, you don't have this in this text, the close relationship between Judaism and Christianity causes some people to believe that, quote, an ass's head is our God. And so this becomes now a well-known belief throughout part of the Roman world. And sure enough, in the 19th century, we discovered this graffito. You'll lower that a bit there. And what it was found in the Palatine Hill in Rome in the 19th century, to be precise, 1856. And it was scratched in plaster on a wall of a room that was discovered there. And what you see here is fascinating. You see somebody somebody was crucified on a cross. He's being worshipped by, and the text here says, Alexamenos worships his God. You can read the word theon on the bottom. And sure enough, you have somebody crucified with the head of an ass, of a donkey. In other words, when you get to the 19th, it's not discovered in the 19th century, but this is clearly from one of the first centuries of the Christian era, where you find that there's already, the ass worship has moved from Judaism into Christianity as well, and the two of them somehow are linked together. I'd like to sum up and then leave a little time for some questions if we have that time. But I want to make a point. First of all of this Greco-Roman Haggadah material, as I called it, was ultimately lost. Because once the Roman world embraced Christianity, it reverted back to the biblical account of the Exodus, clearly, of course, adding certain Christological elements to the story, but that's only to be understood. But as a result, this whole picture that I've laid out for you today, and I just chose a few select pieces, this picture was lost. And almost nobody knows any of this today. Nobody will tell you that it was because of scurvy or malady or what have you that the Israelites were evicted and so on. But it does tell us something about how, I don't know if I should use the word flexible, or the license that historians of the past allowed themselves. In other words, what you had here were agendai, to paint the Jews as being antisocial, to paint the Jews as not fighting for freedom, but in fact being evicted because they can spread disease, right? Again, something that we will hear in the Middle Ages as well. They'll spread disease, hence they have to be evicted. And also they don't worship the gods, they destroy temples. And so historians wanting to use that type of calumny then simply retold the Exodus story. And this tells us, of course, something about all historians. I'm one of that trade, and that is, and I always tell this to my students, usually in ending a course, and I'll tell them, you know, there's one thing that even God cannot do. God cannot change history. Only historians can do that. And here we've seen a perfect example of how historians allowed themselves license, what do you want to call it, poetic license, but it was licensed to fit an agenda. If there are any questions, Danielle, do you already have questions on the chat?
So if any of you guys would like to ask anything, you know, you have the opportunity to do so via chat. I will read your questions and we can take it from there. I will kind of take the opportunity to first thank you, Professor Isaiah Gafni, for this wonderful lesson. And the chat is open to me. People are waving hello. Florence, do you have a question? I see you raising your hand. Let me unmute you 1 second. Florence, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Would
Yes.
you like to ask a question?
Yes. What the professor presented is fascinating. The total corruption of the story as we learn it. But in the total corruption, there's some kind of element of the truth. It's as if somebody heard the truth and then put it on its head. So where did they get the little bit that they did get?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Because again, who was the conduit? We have no evidence, and I'll tell you, I'm glad you asked that question. We have no evidence that Greeks or Romans ultimately read the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Torah, right, or of the Bible, which was translated in Alexandria in somewhere around the 2nd century BCE, in stages. But we have no evidence that they read this. Now, it could be, and I think it was certainly the case with Hecataeus, he certainly had a Jewish informant, right? He actually tells us that he knew a Jew, and that's Hecataeus.
I can see an informer.
You know, I only wish that everybody followed Hecataeus, right? He was still positive, right? He gave us a very, I thought, sympathetic approach to the Exodus story. Where the other Greeks and Romans got this from, nobody knows. It's hard to say, right? I suspect that Jews lived in major, well, not suspect, I know this as a fact. They lived in major cities, not only in the Middle East, ultimately in Greece, ultimately in Rome. I recommend anyone who wants to visit the Jews of ancient Rome, go to the catacombs, and you'll see fantastic inscriptions of the Jews there. And there was discourse, and they would hear stories. But again, it's one thing to hear a story from a Jew. A Jew might tell him something. It'll be warped, it'll be changed, but it'll also be turned around depending on your personal attitude towards these Jews. And so that's probably what's happening. In other words, there's common discourse. Again, I don't think it's based on reading texts, but they seem to have picked up something and worked with it. And that's what I said, you know, beware of historians that have one little tiny bit of fact and then write a whole book about it, right? And here they can write a whole book, but clearly they could access at least bits and pieces of the story. Any other questions?
So we have a few from the chat. Barbara Friedman is asking, could the image of a donkey be connected to the temple set up in Dan and Bethel in the Israelite kingdom with the image of the symbol of Joseph?
I don't think so, because it's much later. It comes from the Roman period, right? We're talking about the first centuries already of the Common Era. So we're way, way removed from that period. But again, I would stress, and this is something that we saw today, Jews are attacked as being non-believers. In other words, they don't follow the gods. Moses told them, don't put your trust in gods. In other words, so somewhere along the line, they either said that these people were total atheists, or at best, and of course you get the irony here, Strabo told us that Moses left Egypt because he couldn't accept the fact that the Egyptians were worshiping gods in the form of animals. And then what happens is, again, you have a counter history where the Greeks will attack Jews as worshiping the head of an ass, in other words, a god in the form of an animal. So what they're doing is turning these stories around, as it were, and aiming them back. But I don't think it has anything to do with Dan, and which is much, much earlier in time. Any other questions?
So we also have a Sarah who's asking, she's also mentioning that the image of the Mashiach riding a donkey, does that have any influence in the ass worship?
Well, I wish I could say I knew. That's a great question, right? Again, and by the way, I don't know, who is it that asked the question, because her question is even better than she might realize. You know where the Mashiach is biding his time. He's biding his time in Rome, waiting, right? And there are stories in rabbinic literature that he's sitting among the poor and the wounded, and he's wrapping his various wounds and so on. The Mashiach will come out of Rome according to rabbinic literature. So here, right, we have this messianic element in Rome, but I don't know if it's connected in any way with the graffito that we saw before, except to say that, yes, things are happening in the city of Rome as well. But by the way, it's very interesting. When we talk about reverse history, in the first centuries of the Common Era, you find Christians coming from the Roman Empire from the West to Judea, to Israel, to look for artifacts that link them up with Christianity. At the very same time, you have rabbis going from the land of Israel to Rome, where they claim they saw the menorah, and they saw a curtain from the temple, and they saw all sorts of other artifacts. So you have this travel and going in opposite directions. Jews go to Rome to look for ancient artifacts, and Christians go to Israel to look for ancient artifacts. Yes,
Exactly.
anything else?
So we have Isaac, who is thanking you for the lecture, and he was wondering, where do the Egyptian sources sit? Do they say everyone was exiled or left by choice? And then someone by the name of Akiva, adds, and maybe the stories of the drownings in the desert echo the drowning of the Egyptians in the sea.
Oh, again, a counter history, right? In other words, taking an event and turning it upside down. But again, nowhere do the Egyptian sources or the Greco-Roman sources tell us that the Jews wanted out because they were slaves, right? And they wanted their freedom, in other words, which is the element of the Exodus story that we, of course, stress and cherish. But no, that's missing in all of the sources that we saw today. I skipped over a very famous Egyptian source since the question was asked. Already in ancient literature, there is an attempt to link Jews with one of the most popular fables, stories, myths in Egyptian history, the story of the Hyksos. According to ancient Egyptian tradition, Egypt, way back in history, was overrun by shepherds who conquered the land and ruled over it very, very strictly. And it's only at a later stage that there was a rebellion, and these Hyksos, these shepherds, were kicked out of the country. Now, it's very interesting. The Hyksos story has absolutely no connection with Jews, with Israelites, with the Exodus story. But at some later stage, and we have the story from an Egyptian priest known as Manetho, who tells us that at some stage, these Hyksos were evicted from the land. At first, they went to Damascus and elsewhere, and then comes the final line of the story. And finally, they went to Jerusalem and built a city, etc., etc. In other words, if you want to label any story with it was the Jews, all you have to do in antiquity is say, and then they went to Jerusalem and founded a city. So somewhere along the line, wanted to connect the Hyksos, these shepherds, with the Israelites who conquered the land of Egypt. But that, of course, happens at a much later stage. Yes.
So we'll just take one last question if it's fine with you. Let's see. Larry Harbour is asking, and I'm not sure of the context, but maybe you can help us out, Professor Gafni. Why is it important for us to learn this if the world now ignores this?
It's important for me as a historian. I want to know why certain Romans and certain Greeks behaved towards Jews in antiquity the way they did. When I read these stories, right, I can understand their mindset. Certainly, I don't consider this history, but it's important as mindset. In other words, it's in there. And remember, who read these books? The intellectuals, not your common man, who probably didn't even know how to read, but intellectuals would have read this. And so, and it's the intellectuals that embrace some of this anti-Jewish imagery that we saw today. I think it's important simply to understand the past. In other words, for me, I'm a historian of the past. I live in the first centuries of the Common Era. I make these very brief, right, forays into your century, but you can know that right after this lecture, I'm going back home where I belong in the first and second century. But I think it's simply important to know what they thought about Jews at the time. Again, nobody knows this material today. If you're not a scholar of the period, I doubt if you know, a tiny segment of people throughout the world are even aware of most of the stories that we saw today. But I thought it's for us on Pesach, right? It's interesting that we read these alternative Exodus stories, what I call the Greco-Roman Haggadah, not because I believe in their veracity, but because I do believe that it might unfortunately have shaped people's minds in the ancient world. That's it.
So thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Again, we wish you, all the best and Hamshech Chag Sameach. And I would also like to invite you all to a lecture called Exodus, Narrative or Anti-Narrative with Dr. Aviva Zornberg. That's going to take place tomorrow, so you're all more than welcome to join us. Details will be on our website, on betavichai.org.il. And that's it. We wish you all the best, and thank you all for being with us. Have a good day.
Okay, and thank you, Danielle, for all your help.
No problem. Bye-bye.